A heartless director repeatedly mistreated a horse backstage on a movie set, thinking his actions would go unnoticed. But in his tyrannical abuse, he failed to notice that Keanu Reeves was watching him. And unlike the other staff at the production, he was not someone who would stay silent. Keanu Reeves guided his car along the roads of Santa Clarita, the purr of the engine a stark contrast to the quiet countryside. As he approached his destination, the silhouette of a large rectangular building loomed on the horizon, its industrial facade a jarring interruption to the natural beauty surrounding it. Keanu slowed the car as he pulled into the parking lot of what appeared to be an abandoned storage facility. The faded sign above the main entrance read, "Willow Creek Storage Facility" in chipped paint, a ghostly reminder of the building's original purpose. Keanu stepped out of his car, the crunch of gravel under his feet breaking the silence. He took a moment to survey his surroundings, noting the wooden pallets and old equipment scattered across the area. When Keanu finally emerged into the main hall, he was struck by the stark contrast to the building's exterior. The cavernous space stretched out before him, its high ceilings supported by exposed beams from which industrial lights hung on chains. Plywood walls lined with black drapes created makeshift studio spaces throughout the hall. Green screens and backdrops transformed sections of the industrial space into film sets. As his eyes scanned the bustling scene, Keanu's gaze fell upon a familiar face. Elliot Grayson stood in the center of the hall, deep in conversation with a harried-looking production assistant. Even from a distance, Keanu could see the tension in her posture, the weight of responsibility evident in the set of her shoulders. Elliot glanced up, her eyes meeting Keanu's across the crowded space. For a moment, her professional mask slipped, revealing a flash of relief and genuine warmth. She quickly excused herself from her conversation and made her way towards him, navigating the obstacle course of equipment and busy crew members with practiced ease. "Keanu," she called out as she approached, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and gratitude, "you made it." They met with a warm handshake that turned into a quick, affectionate hug. As they embraced, Elliot leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Thank you for joining this movie and for doing it for me, all the way here in Santa Clarita. I know you have a bad past with Martin Langston, the director, and it's not easy for you to work with him, but I appreciate it more than you know." Keanu pulled back, offering Elliot a genuine smile. "Don't mention it, Elliot. Anything for you. We've worked together before, and it's always been a pleasure. I'm looking forward to seeing what we can create here." As they spoke, Keanu couldn't help but notice the underlying tension in Elliot's posture. There was more to this situation than met the eye, and he had a feeling he was about to find out what it was. The bustling activity of the set continued around them, but in that moment, it felt as if they were in a bubble of calm amidst the chaos. As the bustle of the set continued around them, Elliot gently took Keanu's elbow, guiding him towards a quieter corner of the warehouse. The change in her demeanor was subtle but noticeable to Keanu's perceptive eye. Her shoulders tensed slightly, and her eyes darted around, ensuring they weren't overheard. They found a relatively secluded spot near a stack of equipment cases. Elliot leaned against one, her voice dropping to just above a whisper as she began to share confidential information about the film's production. "There's something you should know, Keanu," she began, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that spoke volumes. "I'm not just acting in this film, I'm also co-producing it, alongside a private investor." Keanu's eyebrows raised slightly at this revelation, but he remained silent, allowing Elliot to continue. He could sense there was more to come, and his instincts were quickly proven correct. "We're planning to announce this to the media in 4 weeks, Elliot explained, the pressure evident in her voice. She ran a hand through her hair, a nervous gesture Keanu recognized from their previous collaborations. "It's being kept under wraps for now. That's why it's so crucial that we capture perfect scenes today. My co-producer is one particular about the quality of the footage." Keanu nodded slowly, processing the information. The stakes were clearly higher than he had initially realized. "I appreciate you telling me this, Elliot," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "You can count on me to give it my all. I understand the pressure you're under." A flicker of relief passed over Elliot's face, but it was quickly replaced by concern as Keanu continued, "I'm sorry for arriving late. I hope it hasn't caused any issues with Martin." At the mention of the director's name, Elliot's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, choosing her words carefully. "About that. I know you and Martin have had your differences in the past. Are you sure you're okay working with him? I wouldn't have asked if I had any other choice, but—" Keanu took a deep breath before responding, his tone measured. "I no longer hold a grudge from our previous argument," he said, though the slight tension in his jaw suggested there was more to the story. "But I won't lie to you, Elliot. The man can be difficult to work with. Still, I assure you, I'm committed to giving my best performance. This project clearly means a lot to you, and I'm here to support that." Elliot reached out and squeezed Keanu's arm gratefully, her relief palpable. "Thank you, Keanu. I'm sure you'll do your best as always. Your professionalism is one of the reasons I was so keen to have you on board." With the air somewhat cleared, Elliot led Keanu to the makeshift preparation area at the back corner of the cavernous hall. As they walked, she filled him in on more details about the production, her voice low but animated, as she described the unique challenges and opportunities presented by their unconventional shooting location. The preparation area was a hive of activity, makeup artists and costume designers working efficiently in the limited space. Elliot explained that Martin and the main crew were finishing a studio shoot before joining them for Keanu's scenes with the horse. "I'm looking forward to meeting the horse," Keanu commented, as a makeup artist began working on him. The process was minimal and efficient, reflecting both the production's tight schedule and the casual nature of the planned scenes. As Keanu underwent his transformation, Elliot remained nearby, her presence a comforting constant amidst the controlled chaos of the set. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of excitement and tension, the kind that often preceded important shoots. Keanu found his mind wandering to his past experiences with Martin Langston. Their last collaboration had ended in a heated argument, the details of which were still vivid in Keanu's memory. Martin's perfectionism had bordered on tyranny, his treatment of the crew leaving much to be desired. Keanu had stood up to him then, a confrontation that had led to a rift between them. Now, years later, Keanu wondered if time had softened Martin's edges, or if he would find the director unchanged. He was prepared for either scenario, determined to maintain his professionalism regardless of what awaited him. As the afternoon wore on, Keanu found himself being led outside behind the warehouse. The transition from the cool, dimly lit interior to the warm, sun-drenched exterior was jarring, and he blinked rapidly, allowing his eyes to adjust to the brightness. Before him stretched a small fenced area where a magnificent brown horse stood drinking water from a trough. The animal's coat gleamed in the sunlight, muscles rippling beneath its skin with each small movement. This, Keanu realized, must be Stella, his equine co-star for the upcoming scenes. Two men stood nearby, watching the horse with attentive eyes. As Keanu approached, one of them stepped forward, extending his hand in greeting. "Mr. Reeves," the man said warmly, "I'm Berto, the animal caregiver for the production. It's a pleasure to meet you." He gestured to his companion, a younger man with a weather-beaten face that spoke of long hours spent outdoors. "And this is Rachel, a representative from the farm where we rented Stella." Keanu shook hands with both men, his gaze continually drawn back to Stella. There was something majestic about her presence, a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Drawing from his past experience with horses, gained through various film roles and personal interest, Keanu began to move towards her with deliberate slowness and care. His body language was open and non-threatening, each step measured and purposeful. Keanu was acutely aware of the importance of this first interaction. Horses, he knew, were incredibly perceptive animals, and the foundation of trust he established now would be crucial for their scenes together. Berto, observing Keanu's approach, produced a small bag from his pocket. "We brought some treats for you to give her," he explained, handing Keanu a few carrots and apple slices. "It's a good way to break the ice, so to speak." Grateful for the offering, Keanu accepted the treats with a nod of thanks. He continued his approach to Stella, speaking in soft, soothing tones as he drew near. "Hello, beautiful," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Stella's ears perked forward at the sound, her liquid brown eyes focusing on Keanu with intelligent curiosity. "We're going to be working together today. I hope we can be friends." Keanu held out a carrot, palm flat, allowing Stella to make the choice to accept it. For a moment, the horse regarded him, nostrils flaring slightly as she caught the scent of the treat. Then, with gentle delicacy, she took the carrot from his hand. As Stella crunched on the treat, Keanu continued to speak to her, his voice low and soothing. He praised her beauty, explaining in simple terms the collaboration they were about to embark upon. To an outsider, it might have seemed silly to talk to a horse this way, but Keanu knew the importance of establishing a connection, of allowing Stella to become comfortable with his presence and his voice. The moment was peaceful, a stark contrast to the bustling activity inside the warehouse. Keanu felt a sense of calm wash over him as he bonded with Stella, his natural affinity for animals evident in every gentle touch and soft word. He offered her an apple slice, smiling as her velvety lips tickled his palm. However, the tranquil scene was abruptly interrupted by the arrival of Martin Langston. The director's presence seemed to shift the atmosphere, introducing a subtle tension that hadn't been there before. Keanu felt Stella tense slightly under his hand, picking up on the change in energy. "Ah, Keanu," Martin called out, his voice overly jovial. "I see you've met our star." Keanu turned to face the director, keeping one hand on Stella's neck in a gesture that was both calming for the horse and grounding for himself. "Martin," he greeted, his tone polite but reserved. Martin approached, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. He was a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and the kind of tan that spoke of long hours on golf courses rather than film sets. "I wanted to apologize for our past conflicts," he said, the words sounding rehearsed. "Water under the bridge, I hope." Before Keanu could respond, Martin clapped his hands together, his demeanor shifting to one of impatience. "Now, we really should begin filming immediately. We're on a tight schedule and daylight is burning." Keanu nodded, sensing the underlying urgency in Martin's tone. "Of course, where will we be shooting?" "The location for our outdoor scene is at Willow Creek Farm," Martin explained, gesturing vaguely towards the horizon. "It's just a 10-minute walk from here. The crew is already setting up." As the team began to prepare for departure, loading equipment into production vehicles, an idea struck Keanu. He looked at Stella, then back at Martin. "Instead of loading Stella into the truck," he suggested, "what if I ride her to the farm? It could save time and help warm her up to my presence." Martin's reaction was swift and barely concealed. He rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath, "This is not a recreation." However, catching himself, he attempted to mask his disapproval with a strained smile. Keanu, noticing the director's reaction, quickly added, "It would allow us to bond, so we can shoot the scene right away when we reach the farm. It could save us time in the long run." Martin seemed to wrestle with the idea for a moment, before sighing in resignation. "You do what you think best," he said dismissively, before turning and entering one of the vans. As the production team departed for the farm, Keanu turned back to Stella. He approached her once more, offering another apple slice. "What do you say, girl?" he asked softly. "Shall we take a ride?" Stella nickered softly, accepting the treat. Keanu took this as assent and, with Rachel's help, prepared to mount. As he settled into the saddle, he couldn't shake the feeling that this simple decision might have more significant consequences than he could have imagined. The sun hung high in the sky, painting the landscape in bright hues of gold and blue as Keanu guided Stella onto the grounds of Willow Creek Farm. The gentle clip-clop of her hooves on the packed earth created a soothing rhythm, a stark contrast to the bustling activity that greeted them upon arrival. The production team had arrived just minutes earlier, and the area was already a hive of activity. Crew members scurried about, setting up lights, adjusting cameras, and laying down tracks for smooth dolly shots. The air buzzed with a mixture of excited chatter and barked orders, creating an atmosphere of controlled chaos that was familiar to Keanu from his many years in the film industry. As Keanu dismounted, he gave Stella an affectionate pat on the neck. "See you on set, girl," he murmured, before handing her reins to Rachel, who had followed them. Rachel led Stella away to prepare her for the scene, leaving Keanu to make his way towards the center of the activity. Martin Langston stood amidst the chaos, his voice rising above the general din as he directed the crew to various positions. His eyes lit upon Keanu, and he waved him over impatiently, barely pausing in his instructions to a harried-looking camera operator. "Keanu, there you are," Martin said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "We've chosen the perfect spot for filming. The light is fantastic, but we're racing against the clock. Get yourself to makeup and we'll begin as soon as possible." Keanu nodded, making his way to the makeshift makeup area that had been set up in the shelter of a large oak tree. As the makeup artist touched up his appearance, he listened to the buzz of conversation around him, piecing together more details about the scene they were about to film. The story, as he understood it, required him to rescue Stella from smugglers and navigate treacherous terrain to deliver a critical message to resistance fighters. It was a scene that demanded both physical prowess and emotional depth, a challenge that Keanu was eager to tackle. As the makeup artist put the finishing touches on his look, Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. He drew upon his years of experience, mentally preparing for the physical and emotional demands of the scene ahead. The first few takes went smoothly. Keanu, drawing on his extensive experience with horses from previous films and his personal life, handled Stella with confidence and skill. The camera captured their easy rapport as they galloped across open fields, the golden hour light lending a cinematic quality to every frame. Martin, watching the footage on a nearby monitor, nodded with grudging approval. "Good, good," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Let's move on to the more challenging terrain." It was as they transitioned to scenes involving gravel and sandy areas that problems began to emerge. Stella, who had been cooperative up to this point, suddenly became difficult to control. She shied away from certain areas, forcing Keanu to constantly adjust his riding to keep her on mark. "Cut!" Martin's voice rang out for what felt like the 100th time. The frustration in his tone was palpable as he strode towards Keanu and Stella. "What's the problem? You said you could handle this horse." Keanu dismounted, his brow furrowed with concern. He ran a soothing hand along Stella's neck, feeling the tension in her muscles. "Something's not right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "She's acting unusually skittish. This isn't normal behavior for a well-trained horse." As if to punctuate his point, Stella suddenly reared up, letting out a distressed whinny. Keanu barely managed to dodge her flailing hooves, his heart racing as he realized how close he'd come to being thrown. "That's it," Keanu declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We need to take a break and assess what's going on with Stella. This isn't safe for anyone, not for me, not for the crew, and certainly not for her." Martin's face contorted with frustration, but even he couldn't deny the danger of the situation. The set had gone quiet, all eyes on the confrontation between the star and the director. After a tense moment, Martin threw up his hands in exasperation. "Fine," he spat out, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "But make it quick. We can't afford to fall behind schedule." Keanu nodded, already turning his attention back to Stella. He noticed Rachel and some of the other farm staff hovering nearby, their faces etched with concern. "Could you take a look at her?" he asked, addressing one of the farmhands. "You're familiar with Stella and she knows this place. Maybe you can figure out what's bothering her." Before the farm staff could respond, Martin interjected, his voice sharp. "No, no, no," he said, shaking his head vigorously. "We're not trusting the health of our star to some stable hands. We'll take her back to the warehouse. Our private veterinarian can examine her there." Keanu frowned, not liking the idea of moving Stella if she was in distress. "Couldn't we have the vet come here?" he suggested, trying to keep his tone reasonable. "It would be less stressful for Stella, and we could potentially resume shooting more quickly." Martin's eyes flashed with anger, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I'm the director," he snapped, his voice rising. "I decide what we do. The horse is strong enough to walk on its feet. We're going back to the warehouse quickly, and that's final." "Martin," Elliot's voice cut through the tension. She had been observing silently until now, but could no longer stay quiet. "It's good to see how passionate you are about Stella's treatment, that you're willing to handle this matter yourself. But given the horse's current state, I would suggest handing her over to the farm staff. We can continue with the other scenes while they take care of her." Martin's jaw clenched visibly at Elliot's words. "No," he insisted, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "I want to hear the vet's opinion myself. This animal's making trouble enough, and if I have to spend some of the movie budget on it, I want to know what's going on." The tension on set was palpable. Crew members exchanged uneasy glances, and Keanu caught sight of Elliot watching the exchange with a worried expression. For a moment, he considered pushing back against Martin's decision, but the memory of their past conflicts made him hesitate. Escalating the situation now could jeopardize the entire production, and he was acutely aware of how much was riding on this film for Elliot. With a resigned nod, Keanu acquiesced to Martin's demand. "All right," he said, his voice calm despite the concern gnawing at him. "Let's head back to the warehouse, you, me and Richel. The other crew can stay here. We'll continue the shoot after we know what's going on with the horse." As Martin declared a 30 minutes break, the crew began to pack up the equipment and took their rest. Keanu stayed close to Stella, his hand resting gently on her neck. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, and that this decision to return to the warehouse might be a turning point in ways none of them could yet imagine. The journey back to the warehouse was tense and silent. Keanu rode in the transport vehicle with Stella, his hand resting reassuringly on her neck as they navigated the bumpy road. The horse's unease was palpable, her muscles twitching beneath Keanu's palm with each jolt of the vehicle. As they pulled into the gravel lot of the warehouse, Martin was the first out of the lead vehicle, his impatience evident in every sharp movement as he strode towards the warehouse entrance. Keanu carefully guided Stella out of the transport, noting how she balked slightly. Dr. Vivian Clark, the production's veterinarian, was waiting for them at the back entry of the warehouse. Her face was a mask of professional concern as she approached Stella, her experienced eyes already assessing the horse's condition. "Let's get her inside the examination room where I can check her properly," Dr. Vivian said, her voice calm and authoritative. As they made their way into the back entry of the warehouse, Keanu couldn't help but notice Martin's aggressive handling of Stella. The director's grip on the lead rope was unnecessarily tight, and his tone harsh as he urged the horse forward. Stella's ears flattened against her head, a clear sign of her discomfort. As Dr. Vivian began her examination, the tension in the room was palpable. Keanu stood nearby, his eyes never leaving Stella as the vet methodically checked her over. With each passing moment, Dr. Vivian's frown deepened, her hands moving carefully over Stella's body. "There are multiple concerning injuries here," Dr. Vivian announced after several minutes, her voice tight with professional concern. Martin, who had been hovering nearby, quickly interjected. "It must have happened during one of the movie shoots," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "You know how these things can be. Accidents happen." Keanu frowned, recalling the day's events. "There was a moment where Stella bumped into something," he offered. Though even as he spoke, he felt a nagging doubt. The injuries Dr. Vivian was describing seemed too extensive for such a minor incident. Dr. Vivian shook her head, her expression grave. "These aren't just from today," she said firmly. "I'm finding swollen spots and bruises not just on her legs, but across her neck, body, and rein area. The pattern and extent of these injuries suggest systematic mistreatment rather than accidental injury." A heavy silence fell over the group as the implications of the vet's words sank in. Keanu's mind raced, recalling Martin's earlier rough handling of Stella. He kept his thoughts to himself for now, lacking concrete proof, but he made a mental note to watch the director more closely. Martin broke the silence, his words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to explain. "It must have been the stunt actors," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Or maybe from multiple takes and rehearsal accidents. You know how these things can add up in a production like this." Dr. Vivian's expression remained skeptical, but she continued her examination in silence. Finally, she straightened up, her verdict clear in her eyes before she even spoke. Stella will not be able to continue with the movie for at least a few weeks. There will be treatment and therapies for her legs, she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. Animal care policies are clear on this. You'll need to use a replacement horse for your shoot. And how much is the cost of the treatments? Martin asked. It would be around but not more than $5,000 for the veterinary care, including x-rays, treatment for inflammation, and boarding at an equine rehabilitation facility. Richel, who had been quietly observing until now, stepped forward. We can provide a replacement horse at no additional charge, he offered, clearly trying to find a solution that would work for everyone. And we work close with an equine rehabilitation facility. We can help you discuss their pricing. Martin's frustration was palpable, his focus fixed on the film's tight budget and the need to reshoot scenes rather than Stella's well-being. The charges alone are eating into our budget, he snapped, running an agitated hand through his hair. And let's not forget, this is about wasting perfectly good shots and having to redo everything. Do you have any idea how much time and money that's going to cost us? As the heated discussion about Stella's fate continued, Richel, the farm representative, suggested a compromise. It only makes sense that Stella comes with us to the farm rather than staying here, he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. We can put her in our nursery stable for a while where she'll be comfortable and can receive the care she needs. Martin, however, quickly dismissed the suggestion. After a brief moment of consideration, he shook his head resolutely. No, he said firmly. For now, I want Dr. Vivian to take a closer look at the horse and perform a thorough checkup. The sight of it being unwell is already casting a negative energy, even for the replacement horse. Dr. Vivian nodded in agreement, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. She moved to guide Stella towards the open stable at the back of the warehouse, but to everyone's surprise, Stella balked, refusing to move and becoming increasingly agitated. Keanu, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Perhaps she's already not feeling comfortable from the heat, he suggested, his voice calm and reasonable. Let's just keep her inside the main hall where there are portable fans and air conditioning. It would be cooler than out there. Martin protested immediately, his face flushing with frustration. Have you lost your mind? The horse should stay at the back stable outdoors, he insisted, his voice rising. There's too much risk of damage to our equipment inside. Do you have any idea how much that gear costs? Keanu, his patience wearing thin, retorted, It was your idea in the first place to bring the horse here, Martin. This could have been handled more effectively and efficiently if we had the vet visit the farm instead. Caught off guard by Keanu's direct challenge, Martin's face flushed an even deeper shade of red. He opened his mouth ready to argue, but hesitated, seemingly reconsidering. I need to use the restroom, he said curtly. Do whatever it takes to keep everything safe here. If anything happens to the equipment, Keanu, it's coming out of your pocket. With that, he turned sharply on his heel and strode away briskly. Taking advantage of Martin's absence, Keanu and the team carefully guided Stella further into the main hall. The cavernous space, cooled by fans, seemed to have an immediate calming effect on the distressed animal. Stella's tense muscles began to relax and her breathing evened out. Richel and Berto, the animal caregiver, quickly set about creating a makeshift stable for Stella in one of the far corners of the hall. They used equipment cases and spare lumber to create an enclosed space, lining it with fresh straw for comfort. The dim lighting and cool environment created a soothing atmosphere, and Stella visibly relaxed as she was led into her temporary home. Dr. Vivian observed the horse with a professional eye, nodding approvingly at the setup. Stella is tired enough that she won't create any problems here, she assured them. Berto and I will stay to keep an eye on her. She might just sleep and rest in this cool place, which is exactly what she needs right now. Relieved to see Stella settling in comfortably, Keanu took a moment to survey the main area. His eyes fell on a camera left behind amidst the movie set at the center of the space. A plan began to form in his mind, a way to ensure Stella's safety and potentially uncover the truth about her treatment. Quietly, Keanu approached the camera and turned it on, noting with satisfaction that it was connected to the Wi-Fi network. He adjusted its angle, ensuring it captured the entire area where Stella was resting. His thought was to use it as a makeshift security camera, allowing them to monitor Stella from a distance once they returned to the farm. With the camera in place, Keanu returned to Dr. Vivian, Berto, and Richel, informing them about the setup he had arranged. "This way, we can keep an eye on her even when we're not here," he explained. "It's just a precaution, but I think it's better to be safe than sorry." Just as he finished explaining, Martin returned from the restroom, his face still flushed but his composure somewhat restored. He seemed unaware of the surveillance now in place, his attention focused solely on getting the production back on track. "Keanu, Richel," Martin called out, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "We need to go back to the farm and pick the replacement horse, now. We've wasted enough time here." Keanu nodded. As they walked towards the farm, Martin's agitation was palpable. He ranted about the horse treatment eating into their already limited movie budget, his words becoming increasingly bitter. "This is exactly why I hate working with animals," Martin muttered, more to himself than to Keanu. "Unpredictable, unreliable, and always causing problems. If it weren't for the script requirements, I'd cut every animal scene from the movie." Keanu listened silently, filing away Martin's comments for later consideration. The director's attitude towards Stella and animals in general was troubling, to say the least. Halfway to the farm, Martin suddenly stopped, a look of discomfort crossing his face. "I need to use the restroom again," he announced abruptly. "You two go on ahead, I'll catch up. Keanu, just pick whichever dark color horse you can bond with," he instructed. As Martin turned back towards the warehouse, Keanu and Richel continued their walk to the farm. But with each step, Keanu's unease grew. Something about this situation felt deeply wrong. At the farm, Richel showed Keanu the available dark-colored horses, explaining their temperaments and training one by one. But Keanu found himself unable to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the warehouse, to Stella and to Martin's strange behavior. The afternoon had progressed by the time Keanu finally decided on a replacement horse. He glanced at his watch. Keanu realized that far too much time had passed since Martin had turned back. He tried calling the director's phone, but his calls went unanswered. "Is everything all right, Mr. Reeves?" Richel asked, noticing Keanu's distraction. Keanu hesitated for a moment before responding. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Martin's been gone for a while now. I think I need to go back and check on him." Richel nodded understandingly. "Of course, would you like me to come with you?" Keanu shook his head. "No, stay here with the horses and prepare Marvel, the replacement horse, for our next scene. I'll be back soon." As Keanu hurried back towards the warehouse, Keanu's footsteps echoed through the empty corridors of the warehouse as he made his way back inside alone. His first stop was the restroom, but as he had feared, it was empty. Martin was nowhere to be seen. With growing concern, Keanu sought out Dr. Vivian and Berto. He found them in a small break room, discussing Stella's condition over cups of coffee. "Have either of you seen Martin?" Keanu asked, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. Both shook their heads. "We haven't seen him since the group separated," Dr. Vivian replied, her brow furrowing with concern. "After you left, I applied some medication to Stella," she continued. "It should help keep her calm and less stressed. But Keanu, there's something else you should know. Upon further inspection, I found signs of recent malnourishment in Stella." Berto nodded gravely. "The horse was fine when we rented her from the farm 5 days ago," he added. "So the malnourishment must have happened here, possibly due to the prolonged film schedule and late feeding times." Keanu's frown deepened. Why didn't the care team notice this sooner? Berto shifted uncomfortably. "I had my suspicions," he admitted. "I tried to feed her more in addition to her daily vitamins, but Stella was eating less than usual. I thought it might be due to stress from the filming." Thanking them for the information, Keanu excused himself, saying he needed to check on Stella in the main hall. As he walked away, Dr. Vivian called after him, "Don't disturb her too much, let her rest." Keanu nodded absently, his mind racing as he pieced together the mounting evidence of mistreatment. As he approached the main hall through the winding corridors, a sound stopped him in his tracks. It was Martin's voice, echoing from within the cavernous space. The director's tone was angry, filled with insults about wasted budget and the horse's uselessness. Heart pounding, Keanu crept closer to the doorway. The scene that greeted him through the gap left him frozen in horror. Martin stood over Stella, his foot pressed against the sedated horse's head, forcing it to the ground. Stella whined weakly, unable to resist due to the medication Dr. Vivian had administered earlier. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Keanu stood rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process the cruelty unfolding before him. Martin, sensing a presence, looked up. Their eyes met, and a flicker of panic crossed the director's face. "Keanu," Martin stammered, quickly removing his foot from Stella's head. I was just checking on her. Dr. Vivian and Berto weren't here when I walked in. I was concerned about the equipment's safety." Keanu stepped fully into the room, his voice low and controlled despite the anger boiling inside him. "I just spoke with Dr. Vivian and Berto. They said they were on their lunch break." His eyes narrowed. "I saw what you were doing, Martin. I heard what you said. There's no excuse for your behavior." Martin's facade crumbled entirely, his face contorted with rage as he launched into a tirade. "This animal is ruining the entire movie," he shouted. "Do you have any idea how much budget and time we're wasting because of this useless horse?" "The only person ruining this movie is you, Martin," Keanu replied, his voice steady but filled with barely contained fury. Rather than engaging further in an argument, Keanu maintained his composure and reached for his phone. He dialed 911 even as Martin's face paled with the realization of what was happening. "You can't do this," Martin sputtered, his voice rising in panic. "You're not some hero outside of your movie scripts, Keanu. No one will believe you over me. I'm the director." Keanu ignored Martin's desperate attempts to discredit him, calmly relaying the situation to the 911 operator. As he spoke, he moved to Stella's side, gently stroking her neck and murmuring words of comfort. The die was cast. In the coming moments, the true extent of Martin's actions would be revealed, and the future of the production, and perhaps Martin's career, hung in the balance. The wail of police sirens pierced the warehouse and the nearby farmland area. It grew steadily louder as they approached the warehouse. At the first sound, Martin's eyes widened with panic. Without a word, he bolted from the main hall, rushing towards the parking lot in a desperate attempt to intercept the arriving officers. Keanu, anticipating Martin's move, followed close behind. As they burst out, they saw two police cruisers pulling into the gravel lot, their lights painting the scene in alternating flashes of red and blue. Martin reached the officers first, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," he panted, gesturing wildly towards Keanu. "This man, he's trying to sabotage my movie. We have a history of conflicts, and now he's making up wild accusations about animal abuse." The officers looked between Martin and Keanu, their expressions neutral as they assessed the situation. Keanu remained calm, his hands visible, and his posture non-threatening. "Why don't you tell us exactly what's going on here, sir?" one of the officers asked Martin, his tone professional but skeptical. Martin launched into an increasingly convoluted tale, weaving together half-truths and outright lies. He spoke of long-standing grudges, alleged threats from Keanu, and a supposed vendetta against the film. With each passing moment, his story became more implausible, his gestures more frantic. Keanu waited patiently, allowing Martin to thoroughly entangle himself in his web of deceit. When the director finally ran out of steam, Keanu spoke up, his voice steady and clear. "Officers, if you'll follow me, I can show you exactly what happened," he said, gesturing towards the warehouse entrance. As they made their way back to the main hall, Keanu calmly explained the events of the day, from the initial problems on set to the discovery of Stella's injuries. When they reached the makeshift stable area, Keanu pointed out the camera he had set up earlier. "I had a feeling something wasn't right," he explained, "so I activated this camera as a security measure. It captured everything that happened in this room." Martin's face drained of color as he realized the implications. You set me up?" he sputtered, his voice a mix of rage and disbelief. Keanu shook his head. "The camera was for Stella's protection," he replied. "It was meant to allow us to monitor her from the farm. I never imagined it would capture what it did." One of the officers stepped forward to examine the camera. After a few moments, he nodded to his partner. "The footage is clear," he confirmed. "We'll need to take this as evidence." As the reality of the situation sank in, Martin's demeanor changed from defensive to desperate. "You can't do this," he shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Keanu. "I'll ruin you in this industry. You'll never work in Hollywood again." The officers moved quickly to restrain Martin, reading him his rights as they led him away. His threats about destroying Keanu's career echoed hollowly through the warehouse, serving only to further demonstrate his true character. As Martin was escorted to the waiting police cruiser, Dr. Vivian and Berto returned, their eyes wide with shock as they took in the scene. Keanu quickly filled them in on what had transpired. "I can't believe it," Dr. Vivian said, shaking her head in disbelief. "I knew something wasn't right, but I never imagined it was this bad." Berto moved to Stella's side, gently stroking her neck. "No wonder she was so skittish," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Poor girl must have been terrified." Just then, Keanu's phone rang. It was Elliot, her voice tight with worry. "Keanu, what's going on? We heard police sirens from the farm." In measured tones, Keanu explained the situation. Elliot's gasp of disbelief was audible even through the phone. "I'll be right there," she said, ending the call. As the police finished securing the scene and taking statements, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The day's shooting was effectively over, the future of the production now uncertain. But as Keanu looked over at Stella, now resting peacefully under Dr. Vivian's watchful eye, he knew that regardless of what happened to the film, they had prevented a far greater tragedy. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Police officers came and went, taking statements and collecting evidence. The warehouse, once a hub of creative energy, now felt more like a crime scene. Keanu found himself at the center of it all, recounting the day's events over and over to various officials. He spoke of his initial suspicions, the mounting evidence of abuse, and his decision to set up the camera. Each retelling made the reality of the situation sink in deeper. As the afternoon wore on, more members of the production team arrived, drawn by the news of Martin's arrest. Their reactions ranged from shock to disbelief to outrage. Elliot, who had rushed over from the farm, stood by Keanu's side, her face pale with worry. "I can't believe this," she murmured, shaking her head. "How could we not have seen it?" Keanu placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Martin was careful," he said softly. "He made sure to do this when no one else was around. But what matters now is that we caught him, and Stella is safe." As if on cue, Dr. Vivian approached them, her face etched with concern. "I've completed a more thorough examination of Stella," she said. "The extent of her injuries. It's worse than I initially thought. She'll need extensive care and rehabilitation." Elliot's face fell at the news. "The budget," she began, but Keanu cut her off. "I'll cover Stella's treatment and therapy costs," he said without hesitation. "Whatever she needs, for as long as she needs it." Elliot looked at him in surprise. "Keanu, you don't have to do that. The production's future is uncertain right now," Keanu said gently. "But Stella needs help immediately. This is the right thing to do." Elliot nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I need to discuss the film's future with my co-producer, see if we can salvage this project somehow." As Elliot stepped away to make some calls, Jake Miller, the owner of Willow Creek Farm, arrived. His weathered face was a mask of concern as he approached Keanu. "Mr. Reeves," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Jake Miller. I can't thank you enough for what you've done for Stella. She's one of our gentlest, most adaptable horses. The thought of her being abused like this—" Keanu shook Jake's hand firmly. "I'm just glad we caught it when we did," he said. "How long have you known Stella?" Jake's eyes softened as he spoke about the horse. "We've had her since she was a foal," he said. "Watched her grow up, trained her ourselves. She's always been special." His face clouded over. "I'm worried about how this trauma might affect her, especially her trust in people. Dr. Vivian, who had been listening nearby, joined the conversation. "It won't be an easy road," she admitted, "but with proper care and gentle handling, there's hope. Horses are remarkably resilient animals." She went on to outline the extensive care Stella would need, detailing both physical therapy and careful handling to prevent psychological trauma. Jake listened intently, nodding along. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said firmly. "Our staff is experienced in rehabilitating horses. We'll work closely with your medical team to ensure Stella gets the best care possible." As they discussed Stella's treatment plan, Keanu found his mind wandering back to the events that had led to this moment. He realized now that Martin's insistence on bringing Stella to the warehouse instead of using the farm's facilities had been deliberately calculated. The director had wanted to isolate the horse where he could control access and continue the abuse without witnesses. The thought made Keanu's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm. What mattered now was Stella's recovery and ensuring that nothing like this could ever happen again. As the night deepened, the crowd at the warehouse began to thin. Police officers finished their final sweep, evidence bags in hand. Production crew members drifted away, their faces still showing the shock of the evening's revelations. Keanu remained, watching as Dr. Vivian and Jake prepared Stella for transport back to Willow Creek Farm. The horse seemed calmer now, as if she sensed that the worst was over. As they carefully loaded Stella into the transport trailer, Keanu approached her one last time. He stroked her nose gently, murmuring soft words of encouragement. "You're going to be okay, girl," he said softly. "You're safe now." Stella nickered softly in response, her dark eyes seeming to hold a depth of understanding. In that moment, Keanu felt a connection with the animal that transcended words. Despite the traumatic circumstances of their meeting, a bond had been formed. Keanu, opting to follow in his own car, watched as the truck pulled out of the warehouse lot. He fell in line behind it, his mind replaying the events as they made the short journey to the farm next door. The destination was a quarantine stable, where Stella could rest and begin her recovery in peace and safety. As they arrived at Willow Creek Farm, Keanu parked his car and hurried over to the transport truck. The team was preparing to unload Stella, their movements slow and deliberate to avoid causing her any stress. Before they began, Keanu approached the truck's open back, seeking a private moment with Stella. Gently, he reached out and began brushing Stella's mane with his hand. The horse's eyes, which had been wary and frightened earlier, now seemed to hold a glimmer of trust as she gazed at Keanu. "Hey, beautiful," Keanu murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're home now, you're safe." He continued to stroke her mane, his touch gentle and reassuring. "I know it's been a rough day, but you've been so brave." After a moment, Keanu turned to Jake, the farmer, who was overseeing the unloading process. "I'd like to visit Stella in the future, if that's all right," Keanu said. I feel a special connection to her." Jake nodded, a small smile crossing his weathered face. "I think that would be good for her, Mr. Reeves," he replied. "I can see the bond between you two. It could really help with her physical and emotional recovery." With a final pat to Stella's neck, Keanu stepped back, allowing the team to carefully guide Stella down the ramp and towards her quarantine stable. He watched as they led her into the clean, comfortable space that had been prepared for her. Fresh hay covered the floor, and a water trough stood filled and ready. As Stella was settled into her temporary nursery stable, Keanu stood at the stable door, his eyes never leaving the horse. Despite the traumatic circumstances of their meeting, he felt a profound connection to Stella. In her resilience, he saw a reflection of the strength of spirit that could overcome even the darkest of experiences. The incident had exposed the worst of human behavior, but it had also demonstrated the power of intervention and compassion. As Keanu watched Stella begin to explore her new surroundings, tentatively at first, but with growing confidence, he felt a surge of hope. "We'll get through this together, girl," he said softly, more to himself than to Stella, "one day at a time." Keanu knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. Stella's journey to recovery would be long and challenging, but she wouldn't face it alone. And in helping her heal, perhaps they all could find a measure of healing themselves. The story of Stella and Keanu, born from cruelty but blossoming into a tale of rescue and recovery, served as a powerful reminder of the impact one person's actions could have. It was a testament to the enduring spirit of both humans and animals, and the profound connections that could form between them, even in the most unlikely of circumstances.